Hello, welcome to a new edition of the Right Wing Populist Podcast. I am the Right Wing Populist. So today I want to talk about the Democrats. I want to talk about what their future is, who's the leader of the Democratic Party, who's the favorite to be the Democrat nominee, and I sort of want to talk about the trajectory of the Democrat Party over the last 30 years. And I think it's relevant because with some of the struggles the Trump administration is facing right now and the lack of confidence many voters have to it, the Democrats have a big opportunity to take back some voters that they lost from Trump. So I want to talk about that, but before we do, I want to remind you guys, please remember to subscribe, whether it's on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. It's pretty much available wherever you get your podcasts. I'd really appreciate it. And if you are watching on YouTube, please like and comment. That helps with the algorithm. I would really frickin' appreciate it. So the Democrats. So let's go back to the 90s, before Bill Clinton. Before Bill Clinton, the Democratic Party was known as sort of the working man's party. That was, if you look at the most positive interpretation of the Democrats, their whole goal in life as a party was to protect the working men and women. They were the party that was against Wall Street and for Main Street. They were the party looking out for the little guy. That has sort of like been the backbone of the Democratic Party. But in the 1990s, that began to change a bit. Republicans had dominated presidential politics for essentially the last, 16 years, close to 20 years. You had a little bit of a blip with Carter, but Carter only won because of Watergate, let's be honest. And he barely won that election. Ford was a very weak president, a president that hadn't been elected, and he almost beat Jimmy Carter. That just goes to show how unpopular the Democratic Party brand was from, the late 60s all the way into the 90s. But George H.W. Bush wasn't popular, and Bill Clinton was able to win. But one of the ways Democrats are able to regain power is they sort of made a deal with the devil. They started taking more corporate PAC money. They started listening to corporate interests. And you sort of saw that with NAFTA. Bill Clinton is the president that approved NAFTA. And NAFTA basically sold out the working man. Now, you didn't necessarily see the consequences of that till many years down the line, but that was sort of the start of the Democratic Party no longer being aligned with the interests of the little guy and started literally being with big donor interests. So we go from Bill Clinton, we get the Al Gore, quote unquote, loses thanks to Jeb Bush in Florida. And, George H.W. Bush, obviously, terrible George W. Bush, not H.W. George W. Both were terrible presidents, but I'm talking about George W. Bush now. He was a terrible president, obviously. Afghanistan, Iraq, financial crisis. And Obama is able to win in 2008, and he still has the working men and women. Right? George W. Bush, his big accomplishment was unpopular wars and, billionaire tax cuts. Of course, working people were still going to be in line with the Democratic Party after 8 years of hell under George W. Bush. Okay, and Obama wins in huge landslides. However, again, Obama, just like Clinton, he doesn't really address the needs of the working men and women. Remember, Obama was the one who proposed and passed TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was another ridiculous trade deal that just sold out our workers. And Obama didn't stop. He didn't stop any wars. He actually started more wars. And he bailed out the big banks and everything. He didn't go after the big banks. He didn't look out for the little guy either. He was just still a typical corporate Democrat, Barack Hussein Obama. And Obama is able to win re-election in 2012, but you're already starting to see the cracks with working people. Working people, they've seen the effects of NAFTA by now. Their wages aren't going up, even though corporate profits are going up. And working class people, the only reason Obama still does well with that group in 2012 is because Mitt Romney was sort of like, if you want to talk about, you want to have like an image of an elite that's like out of touch with the working men and women, Mitt Romney is like the perfect example of that. Sort of the antithesis of that, Mitt Romney. So even though a lot of working people were skeptical of Obama by then, they weren't going to vote for Mitt Romney, someone who, came across as like the mean boss who would fire you just to like gain like 1% on his profit margins. That's sort of the impression that Romney gave. Whether it's fair or not, that was Obama and his campaign team were very effective at painting Mitt Romney that way in 2012. So Obama still did well with working class people, which is why he was able to win states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio. But after that 4-year period, working class people, they're done with the Democrats, and they're done with Obama, because Obama didn't deliver for working people. At the same time, the Republicans hadn't been delivering for working people either. Let's talk about them for a second. Ronald Reagan, was a very popular president, and working people did like Ronald Reagan. That's how you had the expression Reagan Democrats. You had, blue-collar workers in the Rust Belt, for example, who were union workers who typically would vote Democrat, but they loved Ronald Reagan and they voted Reagan. That's sort of the famous Macomb County. That's sort of like the epicenter of the Reagan Democrats, Macomb County, Michigan. And, Ronald Reagan definitely aligned with the corporate interests in a lot of ways, but he was a true believer in capitalism. He wasn't like one of these corporate whores who sort of masks their corporatism with capitalism. No, Reagan was a true believer in capitalism, and he really believed that capitalism benefited working people. So Reagan was a little bit different than your other Republicans. He wasn't trying to sell workers down the road by pretending he was a capitalist when he was really just a corporatist. Reagan was a true believer in the free market, and he believed it would raise all people out of poverty. And working people saw that. They knew Reagan had their best interests in heart, even if they didn't always agree with some of Reagan's anti-regulation policies or anti-union sentiment. They understood that Reagan had their interests more or less in heart. Or, so. But then we get to George H.W. Bush, and then working class voters are out on the Republican Party. And not that H.W. Bush was a terrible president, but he didn't have the workers at heart. And he was sort of a deep state stooge, George H.W. Bush. He got us into, I think, Iraq War #1, and he was a war whore. The economy did pretty poorly under George H.W. Bush. That's basically how Bill Clinton was able to win. Then, like I said, we get to George W. Bush, terrible president for working people. The economy totally collapses. He sends a bunch of working men and women to go die overseas for his pointless wars. So the point is, both parties, by the end of, as we're getting closer to 2016, both parties, working class people think both parties don't have their best interests at heart. But then a certain someone comes down a golden escalator and changes everything. And here comes Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is not a typical Republican. He starts out the 2016 campaign talking about how our trade deals have screwed our workers. Okay. He talks about how special interests bribes politicians to get certain benefits for them at the expense of working people. And then he talks about how we have to stop all these foreign wars and stop sending our working boys and girls overseas to die for pointless wars. And at the time, it's mostly just working class white people, but working class people in general, they love this type of messaging. That is like sort of the traditional America First messaging. And when Trump comes around, it's basically the start of a changing coalition. And, before Trump, sort of the upper middle class white suburbanites, they were traditionally Republican voters, but under Obama, they were slowly starting to transition towards the Democrats. That's why states like Virginia had switched to Democrat, or states like Colorado had switched to the Democrats. And like I said, working class people were starting to become more skeptical of the Democratic Party and Obama. So they were slowly starting to shift toward Republicans, but very minor shifts. Because again, they didn't trust the Republican Party either. But Trump just accelerates that change. And you see in the election results in 2016, Trump's able to flip states that hadn't voted Republican in decades, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. He won those states because he made massive gains with white working class voters. Voters that would have never thought of voting for a Republican, just 4 years prior. It's because Trump spoke to those issues, And like I said, the Democratic Party had already totally lost their trust. And obviously, Hillary Clinton wasn't going to reassure them that she had their best interest because she was a corporate whore and a warmonger. Now, this sort of gets to the broader question of the Democratic Party is 2016 is a pretty good sort of a case study of the two directions the Democratic Party has sort of been fighting over which direction to actually go in. You have the corporate wing with Hillary Clinton, and then you have the progressive, I would say populist wing in Bernie Sanders. And in 2016, everyone thought Hillary Clinton was going to win the primary in a cakewalk, but it turned into a big fight between her and Bernie because Bernie caught fire because he is a left-wing populist. And Bernie himself did speak to the issues of working class people. He also talked about how our trade deals fucked over workers. And there was also a time when Bernie would talk about immigration. That's another thing I forgot to mention with Trump. Trump was, his messaging on you have to stop illegal immigration is also, working class people like that messaging is because a lot of times illegal immigrants, they compete with some of the jobs working class people are trying to get. And it also fucks with working class people's wages when you have the illegal immigrants undercutting them. That's why Bernie, and to some degree he still is, has always been more or less a critic of illegal immigration. He's against deportations, but he's always, we need a secure border. So in 2016, you have the progressive populist wing and you have the corporate wing. And the Democrats choose the corporate wing, even though there was, maybe some shenanigans that took place at the DNC. Let's not even get into that. And Hillary Clinton becomes the Democrat nominee and she loses. So after she loses, a lot of the progressives in the party are like, you see, you should have gone with Bernie. Bernie spoke to the working class people. We lost this election because we lost working class people. In 2020, we need to go the Bernie route. And in a vacuum, that makes sense, but the Democratic Party doesn't want that because the big dollar interests that now control the Democratic Party, as I mentioned, they don't like Bernie because Bernie is not aligned with corporate interests. Whatever you think of Bernie, he's not a corporatist. I don't agree with a lot of his social policies, and I even don't agree with a lot of his economic policies. He is too left-wing for me because I do believe in capitalism generally. But he is a populist. And I totally support Bernie when he goes after, Big Pharma, although he didn't vote for RFK Jr., so, take that for what it is. But Bernie's always been against, unchecked corporate power, which I support. So the thought process for a lot of progressives was, well, Bernie's going to be the nominee, or a Bernie-like candidate will be the nominee in 2020 because we just ran the experiment when you have a corporatist versus a right-wing populist. Gee, I wonder where that name sounds familiar. A right-wing populist. The right-wing populist will win because America likes populism. Working class people love populism. And there's more working class people than there are, corporate whores on Wall Street. So mathematically that makes sense. But the Democrats don't go the progressive direction in 2020. They go with Joe Biden. And Joe Biden is able to quote-unquote win because of COVID. Okay, if without COVID, Joe Biden does not win that 2020 election. I mean, that's just the simple reality. But Democrats are able to trick themselves into saying, hey, we beat Trump. Joe Biden won. He's a corporate Democrat. That means corporate Democrats are really popular. We don't need to go in a populist direction. We just have to, be a moderate corporate party. However, fast forward to 2024, Kamala Harris replaces Biden because Biden's brains keeps falling out of his ears. And Kamala Harris loses to Trump. And she, again, was just a corporate Democrat. And also, remember this. In all three of Trump's elections, Wall Street actually gave more money to the Democrat Party than the Republican Party. At least at the top of the ticket. That had never happened before for decades prior. Both Mitt Romney, John McCain, George W. Bush all raised more money from Wall Street than their Democrat opponents. So Kamala Harris loses, and now we're sort of back at the original question that I'm seeing is, which direction should the Democratic Party go? Should they go the corporate route or the populist progressive route? Well, last Tuesday, I think you had a pretty good example of these two different paths. Because in New Jersey and Virginia in the governor's races, you had two sort of standard corporate Democrats win. But then in New York City, you had a progressive populist win. And I want to talk about Mamdani for a second because I see a lot of people on the right, which I'm a part of, and I know most of my audience is. They don't seem to really understand Mamdani's appeal. Okay, the reality is he very rarely talked about Israel. He very rarely even talked about, seizing the means of production. Mamdani is a left-wing populist. That's why he won. Because his whole shtick was we have to lower costs in New York City. And, he did a debate, I think during the Democrat primary part of the election, where these moderators asked like a retarded question to all these, different Democrat candidates saying, where would be your first foreign visit as the mayor of New York? I think like half the people on the stage said Israel. But Mamdani said, I'm not going to visit any foreign country. I'm going to focus on New York City. I'm going to stay in New York City. Like, that's the right answer. That's the populist answer. Right there, that just shows his appeal. Okay. Like, Mamdani, is he a communist? Maybe, I don't know. Is he an Islamist? Maybe, I don't know. But he campaigned himself, he postured himself as a populist. That's why he was able to beat Andrew Cuomo, who has like 100% name recognition in New York City, because he was, the former mayor, the former governor of New York, the state. And so you have him, but then again, you also had these moderate, more corporate Democrats win the governor's races in New Jersey and Virginia. So which direction should the Democratic Party go on? Well, I would argue, given the fact that many working people now are skeptical of the Trump administration, I think it's in the Democratic Party's interest to go in the populist direction. Because the question is for the Democratic Party is, can you keep the higher income suburban voter that has switched from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party during the Trump years, can you keep that voter while also now trying to peel back and appeal to working class voters that have abandoned you during the Trump era? That's sort of the question for the Democratic Party. Is like, can you do both those things at the same time? Well, I would argue, at least in the short term, if Trump is not able to turn around some of the problems his administration is facing, it'd be in the Democratic Party's interest to go in a populist direction. Number one, it's the right thing to do for workers. I mean, the fact that you had the president, what's the big union? The Teamsters president speaking at the RNC last year. I mean, that just shows you how much support Democrats have lost with working class voters. So, Trump made, in 2024, Trump not just made gains with working class voters who were white, he made gains with all working class voters of all ethnicities. I mean, you saw that Trump almost won Hispanics. He did win Hispanic men. But you're seeing now in polling that a lot of those working class voters of all ethnicities, they are having question marks of the Trump administration because costs aren't down. Trump seems more focused on, foreign policy instead of domestic policy. And, Trump's going around on Laura Ingraham's show saying that the economy is the greatest ever and that we need to import like 10 trillion people so they can go to college in the United States. It's like, okay, man. Trump's sort of losing it right now. And I love Trump. I know a lot of people listening to this podcast like Trump. I get it. But let's just be honest here. It doesn't do us any good to lie. The administration is struggling right now. I mean, Trump's approval rating on the economy is horrible. Way worse than it ever was during his first term. That's a huge red flag. So, anyway, my point is the Democratic Party, I think it's in their long-term interest if they go in a populist direction. If they go in a populist direction, they will wipe out Republicans in 26, and J.D. Vance will be pretty much fucked in 28, no matter who the Democratic candidate is. Now, luckily for Republicans, the Democratic Party is like a retarded party. Okay. So, my guess is they're going to want to keep going in the corporate direction. And that's going to be the only way Republicans can be competitive in 26 and why J.D. Vance still has a pretty good chance of winning in 28. Because people don't like corporatism. We've run the experiment. The corporate candidate almost always loses to the more populist candidate. If you look at American history, that's almost always the case. Trump beat Kamala, Trump beat Hillary, Trump was seen as the more populist candidate. In 2004-2000, believe it or not, George W. Bush was seen as the more populist candidate, particularly in 2000, over Al Gore. Obama was certainly seen as the most populist candidate in 2008 and 2012. The only exception really to the rule you could say would be maybe 2020 with Biden versus Trump. But again, I think COVID totally fucked that up. Sort of the same thing with 2004. You could argue Bush was the more populist candidate versus Kerry. You could argue that either way. But because of the war, you could say George W. Bush was able to win that election. But again, Kerry wasn't a populist either. So that election didn't really have a populist example. But the point is, usually the most populist candidate wins the election. The most anti-war candidate wins the election. The most anti-corporate candidate wins the election. So I think the Democratic Party, if they're smart, which they're not, they're a stupid party, but if they're smart, they will go in the populist direction and they will take back the voters they've lost to Trump. Because remember, the Republican Party was really fucked after 2012 because they weren't gaining enough working class voters to make up for the losses that they were already losing with upper income, college educated voters. So a lot of people thought the Republican Party wasn't going to win a presidential election in decades. But like I said, Trump came around and he righted the ship. So I talk about all this to say is, there was all this talk about the Democratic Party being dead after 2024. I never really believed that. People always say that. Like I said, people said that about Republicans in 2012. It's never really true. And then we saw that last week. Democrats still have a lot of fight in them. And again, the big question to me is, which direction are they going to go? Are they going to go in the more populist, progressive part or the corporate part? Now, it should be noted before we go that when I say progressive, progressivism can be weaponized by a lot of corporate Democrats. And a lot of times they'll use race as a substitute for class because it's easier to talk about race because there's sort of less tangible ways you can really attack that without talking about policies that are never going to be implemented, like reparations. So a lot of corporate Democrats will talk like they're progressives when they're really not. They're just using that to try to mask their corporatism. Usually, true left-wing progressives are populists. So that's why I'm using that term interchangeably. But anyway, so that's sort of my thoughts on the Democratic Party. It's going to be very interesting to see which direction they go on. The Democrat primary, I think, is going to be more interesting than the Republican primary in 28 because I think J.D. Vance is sort of the clear-cut favorite. So we'll see. Anyway, folks, thanks for listening. Again, before we go, please remember to subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. Also, like and comment if you're listening on YouTube. I really appreciate it, folks. We'll be back tomorrow.